Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're taking a look at what might seem like a deceptively simple question, especially for a philosopher like yourself. What are ordinary objects?
Yeah.
We're not just looking for a simple definition here. We want to explore how even really basic things, your shoes, that tree outside, how those things can pose some really interesting and challenging questions in metaphysics.
Right. Absolutely. I think as a philosopher, you've probably already grappled with some really fundamental questions about the nature of reality, right?
Yeah.
But this deep dive, we're going to be focusing specifically on the surprising complexities that arise when we start thinking very carefully about these ordinary things.
Right. And our goal here is to kind of journey through different philosophical positions on these ordinary objects. We're going to see why the initial intuitive grasp we have of them, just sort of pre-philosophically, why that runs into some pretty big philosophical problems. Mm-hmm. And then we'll see how philosophers have tried to address and resolve these problems. And some of those attempts are, they're quite radical. So be prepared to have your understanding of existence itself challenged by the seemingly mundane.
Okay. So one way to start thinking about this is to begin with a viewpoint that I think many of us might find pretty intuitive, at least initially. This is the conservative view. And the conservative view basically says that our everyday judgments about the objects around us, they're, by and large, correct.
Yeah.
So when you look around and you see, a bicycle leaning against a wall or a book on a shelf, the conservative says, yeah, that's pretty much what's there.
So for the conservative, what would characterize these ordinary objects?
So ordinary objects would be things that fall under sort of categories that we naturally perceive as having instances. Things like cats and clouds and coffee cups.
Right.
And we can contrast those with extraordinary objects, which would be things that common sense doesn't really lead us to believe exist.
Right.
But it's important to keep in mind that even this seemingly straightforward view, the idea that the world is basically the way it appears to us, even that view runs into some pretty serious challenges once we subject it to philosophical scrutiny.
Yeah. And this is where things get really fascinating. I mean, philosophers, when they examine ordinary objects really carefully, they come across what they have called 3 unpalatable consequences of this conservative view.
Right.
And so the first of these unpalatable consequences is that it seems like our sort of intuitive view might lead to an overpopulated ontology.
Right.
We might end up having way more entities than we ordinarily assume there are.
Right.
You might have multiple sort of overlapping objects in the same place.
Exactly. Right.
The second unpalatable consequence has to do with arbitrariness.
Right.
If we accept some kinds of ordinary objects, why not others that seem to be ontologically very similar? Where do we draw the line and what justifies that distinction?
Right.
It can seem surprisingly arbitrary.
And then the third consequence is that we get these really kind of unsettling indeterminacies, not just in our language, but maybe even in the world itself.
Right.
So we might get indeterminacies in truth values, whether something is true or false. We might get indeterminacies about the identity of objects, which object is which. And we might even get indeterminacies about whether an object exists or not.
Right. Right. And so it's these, these are really deep and really fascinating problems. And these problems have led some philosophers to a view called eliminativism, which is the idea that we should just deny the existence of a wide range of these ordinary objects.
Right.
Whereas other philosophers have gone in the completely opposite direction towards permissive views, which counterintuitively maybe embrace a much more populated ontology, saying there are even more objects than our everyday thinking might suggest.
Okay. So let's look at eliminativism a bit more closely. So eliminativism, at its core, it's the denial that many of the ordinary objects that we take for granted, that these things actually exist as the unified entities that we perceive them to be. And one of the most radical expressions of eliminativism is a view called nihilism. Now, this isn't nihilism in the ethical or political sense.
Right.
Metaphysical nihilism claims that nothing ever truly composes anything.
Right.
So every object, according to this view, is mereologically simple.
So it has no parts.
It has no parts, exactly.
Right.
So what this means is that, take something like a car.
Right.
The nihilist would say, well, what appears to be a car is just simples arranged car-wise.
Right.
It's just a particular configuration of fundamental partless entities. And similarly, we might have simples arranged table-wise, but there's no actual unified table that exists.
Right.
So it's a very radical denial of compositionality in the world as we ordinarily experience it.
And it's interesting, too, that nihilism, this view, can be combined with a lot of other seemingly different metaphysical views. Like you could be a nihilist and also an existence monist.
Right.
The view that there's only one fundamental entity.
Right. The blobjack.
Yeah. The blobjack, sometimes it's called.
Right.
And then, you could also have the even more extreme view, extreme nihilism, which says that no objects whatsoever exist.
Right. Yeah.
So, I mean, this is about as radical as you can get. But, a lot of the arguments for eliminativism, they stop short of this kind of radical claim about universal partlessness.
Right.
Right. So a lot of eliminativists are willing to grant that composition occurs in certain limited domains.
Right.
And so a prominent example of this is organicism.
Yeah.
And so organicism says that composition occurs if and only if the activities of the parts together constitute a life.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So on this view, maybe you exist as a composite organism, but the pen in your hand does not. So the idea is to try to find some principled basis for composition that excludes most ordinary objects.
Right. And the motivations behind this selective allowance of composition vary.
Mm-hmm.
So the philosopher Peter van Inwagen, for example, he argues that organicism gives us the best answer to what's called the special composition question.
Right.
Which is the question of, when do some things compose something else?
Right.
And he thinks that, organicism, this criterion of life, that allows us to exist,
right,
while avoiding some of the thorny issues that come up on more liberal views of composition.
Yeah. And then there's Trenton Merrick's, right, who has this view about non-redundant causal powers.
Right.
Right. And he thinks that persons, and maybe other biological entities as well, that those things have to exist as genuine composites because they have causal capacities that can't be fully accounted for by just the mere sum of their parts.
Right. So the thought is that causal efficacy that can serve as a kind of marker of genuine objecthood.
Right. Right. But that seems, it raises a challenge too, doesn't it? If we grant composition for organisms on the basis of their life activities or their unique causal powers, you might wonder, well, why couldn't you extend that to other seemingly integrated entities as well?
Yeah.
Right. And on the flip side, couldn't you also use those arguments to undermine the existence of the very biological entities that the organicist wants to preserve?
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're pointing to a potential instability in these more moderate forms of eliminativism.
Right. Right.
And then we get non-nihilistic forms of eliminativism that are actually quite liberal about the occurrence of composition.
Mm.
So Peter Unger, for example, he thinks that there are composite physical objects.
Right.
That correspond to what we ordinarily perceive. So,
right.
There's a collection of atoms occupying the space that we take to be occupied by, a table.
Right.
But he denies that those composites are genuine, ordinary things like stones or furniture.
Yeah.
So for Unger, the atoms that we call a table, they constitute a composite physical object, but it's not in any real or robust sense a table.
Right. Right. So you have this kind of distinction between mere composition and genuine objecthood of the kind that we're familiar with.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So we've looked at positions that try to reduce the number of objects that we believe in. Now let's look at the other side of the spectrum. Let's look at permissivism. So permissivism is the view that the universe is much more ontologically crowded than our everyday intuitions would suggest.
Right.
So it's populated by a whole bunch of what we would normally consider to be extraordinary objects.
Right. And a classic example of a permissivist view is universalism.
Right.
And universalism is often summed up by the slogan that composition is unrestricted.
Right.
So what this means is that for any arbitrary collection of objects, no matter how, scattered or unrelated they might seem, there exists a single unified object composed precisely of those objects.
Right.
Now, universalism doesn't tell us what kind of object such a composite will be. So, if you have some atoms that are arranged in a turkey-like configuration,
right.
Universalism guarantees that there exists an object composed of them,
right.
But it doesn't necessarily follow that object is a turkey in any conventional sense.
Right. Right.
The key inside of universalism is just the denial that there are any fundamental constraints on when composition can occur.
Right. But if we do assume that there are things like turkeys and trout, right?
Yeah.
And that those things have, front halves and back halves,
Right.
then universalism leads to some really counterintuitive consequences.
Yeah.
Right? Like, the famous trout turkeys.
Right.
So this would be a single object composed of, maybe the front half of a trout and the back half of a turkey.
Right.
Right. Imagine this bizarre entity, maybe with scales on one end and feathers on the other.
Right. And potentially, the constituent parts could be located vast distances apart.
Yeah, exactly.
And then it gets even more peculiar when we consider what's called diachronic universalism.
Right.
So diachronic universalism extends this principle of unrestricted composition across time.
Right.
So it says that, for any selection of objects existing at any set of times,
Right.
There is a single object that exists precisely during those times and is composed of those objects at those times.
Right.
So, think about your kitchen table and your neighbor's cat.
Right.
According to diachronic universalism, there's also a spatiotemporally scattered object that is your kitchen table from, Monday to Wednesday.
Right.
And then your neighbor's cat from Thursday to Friday.
Right.
And it just, instantaneously switches its material constituents and its location.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is really strange, right? Because it's really kind of detaching objecthood from spatiotemporal continuity and from this intuitive kind of unity that we associate with objects.
Yeah, exactly. It's a very radical view.
Right.
And then we get even more expansive forms of permissivism that are often grounded in modal properties.
Right.
So in what an object could be like. So the general idea here is that if the fundamental laws of nature don't strictly prohibit an object with a certain potential from existing in a certain place,
right,
then such an object does in fact exist there.
Right.
So if you have a red car parked in your garage,
right,
the fact that nothing there is intrinsically blue, that might rule out a necessarily blue object occupying that exact space.
Right.
But it wouldn't rule out what some philosophers have called an in-car,
right,
which is an object that's also located where the car is,
right,
but that exists necessarily inside the garage.
Right.
So it would instantly cease to exist if the car were driven out.
Right.
So the thought here is that modal constraints are surprisingly weak in determining what fundamentally exists.
Right.
And then permissivism can also manifest in the acceptance of a whole bunch of unexpected parts of ordinary objects.
Right.
So take the doctrine of arbitrary undetached parts.
Right.
Or DAUP for short.
Correct.
So this principle says that for any object in any subregion of the space it occupies, there exists a part of that object that perfectly fills that subregion.
Right.
So what this means is that you get things like what philosophers have called leg complements.
Yeah.
So, there's an object that's composed of your entire body except for your left leg.
Yeah. I mean, so now we've got this really radical expansion of what counts as an object and what counts as the parts of an object.
Right.
Okay. So we've surveyed, this conservative view, the challenges that it faces, and then these really radical alternatives of eliminativism and permissivism.
Right.
And so now, as a philosopher, you're probably asking, well, what are the actual arguments that push us away from our initial common sense ontology and toward these more revisionary positions?
Right.
So let's dig into some of these key philosophical puzzles.
Yeah.
And the first ones we should look at are Sorite's arguments.
Right.
And so the basic idea of a Sorite's argument is that, you can start with the seemingly innocuous kind of vagueness in our concepts and use that to actually challenge the very existence of familiar entities. Yeah.
And Sorite's arguments, they have a common structure. They start with a premise that seems pretty undeniable about a vague concept. And then they proceed through a series of apparently valid steps where, only minute changes are occurring.
Right.
And they ultimately arrive at a conclusion that's clearly absurd.
Right.
And so, think of the classic example of a heap of sand.
Right.
So intuitively, adding or removing a single grain of sand, that doesn't transform a heap into a non-heap or vice versa.
Right.
But if you apply that reasoning repeatedly, you can seemingly argue that, a single grain of sand is a heap, or that, a collection of 1,000,000 grains is not.
Right, right.
And so you can apply the same logic to the existence of objects.
Right.
So consider a Sorite's argument for the elimination of stones.
Okay.
So it might go something like this. Premise 1. Every stone is composed of a finite number of atoms.
Okay.
Premise 2. Something composed of fewer than 2 atoms cannot be a stone.
Okay.
Premise 3. If something composed of n atoms cannot be a stone, then something composed of n plus 1 atoms cannot be a stone.
Okay.
And the conclusion, therefore, there are no stones.
Right. So what premises 2 and 3 together are saying is that no matter how many atoms you have, you'll never have stone, right?
No.
Because if something with n atoms isn't a stone, then something with n plus 1 atoms isn't a stone.
Exactly.
And then combined with premise 1 that everything is made of a finite number of atoms,
Right.
You get this startling conclusion that there are no stones.
Yeah.
Right. And you can imagine constructing similar arguments for individual macroscopic objects like Kilimanjaro.
Right. Yeah.
Right? Imagine removing from the summit of Kilimanjaro molecule by molecule.
Right.
And if removing a single molecule doesn't change whether or not what's left is Kilimanjaro, then you can seemingly argue that even the original mountain wasn't Kilimanjaro, because you can trace it back to, to a point where you've removed practically everything.
Right. And the linchpin of these sorts of arguments often lies in that third premise, the one that says there's no sharp cutoff. So if an aggregate of, n atoms fails to be a stone,
right,
it seems really counterintuitive that adding just one more atom would all of a sudden bring a stone into existence.
Right.
Accepting that there's such a sharp boundary just feels arbitrary and unmotivated.
Right. But a common response to these Sorite's arguments is to say, look, the terms that we're using, like stone, these are inherently vague terms.
Right.
Right. There's not a precise number of atoms that rigidly make something a stone or not a stone.
Right.
Instead, there's this kind of hazy region, right, where it's indeterminate whether the term really applies or not.
Right.
And this idea is often captured by the framework of supervaluationism,
right,
which is that a vague term has multiple permissible precisifications, right? So these are different ways of making the meaning precise.
Right.
So maybe there's one precisification where stone applies to, a collection of 100,000 atoms. Right.
And another one where it only applies to 200,000, right?
Yeah.
And so the supervaluationist will say that a statement involving a vague term is true.
Right.
If and only if it's true under all of the legitimate precisifications, right?
Yeah.
False if it's false under all of them,
yeah,
and indeterminate otherwise.
Right.
And so while there might be, borderline collections of atoms where it's unclear if they are or aren't a stone, the Sorite's premise, the one that says, if it's not a stone with n atoms, it's not a stone with n plus 1,
right,
that premise would just be deemed false.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Because on every acceptable precisification,
right,
there's going to be some point along that spectrum where stone applies to a given aggregate, but not to one with one fewer atom, or vice versa.
Yeah, exactly. However, proponents of Sorite's arguments, they often point out that, even this supervaluationist approach, it seems to require some form of what they call a sharp status transition.
Right. So there's a sharp transition from cases where there's a stone is true on all precisifications,
right, to
cases where it's neither true nor false. It's true on some, false on others.
Right.
So while supervaluationism tries to accommodate vagueness, it doesn't really eliminate the specter of sharp boundaries at the level of semantic status.
Right. Right.
And so this challenge of how to handle vagueness without resorting to either arbitrary cutoffs or radical eliminativism, I think that remains.
Yeah, definitely. And then there's another serious problem for our intuitive ontology that stems from what's called the argument from vagueness.
Right.
And this argument focuses specifically on the question of material composition.
Yeah.
So when do certain objects together compose a further object?
Right. So we intuitively think that when a hammerhead is securely fastened to a handle,
right,
that they compose a hammer.
Yeah.
But if the hammerhead and the handle are lying on opposite sides of a vast warehouse,
yeah,
then we don't think that they compose a hammer.
Right.
And the argument from vagueness is supposed to show that this seemingly straightforward picture, that it's deeply problematic.
Right.
And the basic thought is that it's really hard to come up with non-arbitrary and precise conditions for when composition occurs.
Right.
So one way to formulate the argument from vagueness regarding composition is as follows. So premise one, if some objects compose a further object and others do not,
Right.
then there must exist what's called a Sorites series for composition.
Right.
So this would be, a gradual sequence of cases,
Right.
incrementally transitioning from a scenario where composition clearly occurs
Right.
to one where it clearly does not.
Right.
Premise two, such a series must inevitably contain either a sharp cutoff point where composition abruptly begins or ceases, or a range of borderline cases where it's indeterminate whether composition occurs.
Right.
Premise three, there cannot be any brute, inexplicable, sharp cutoffs in the facts of composition.
Okay.
Premise four, there cannot be any genuine borderline cases of composition.
Okay.
And then the conclusion. Therefore, either unrestricted composition, so universalism is true, or composition never occurs, so nihilism is true.
Right. Okay, so let's look at those premises. So premise one, I think, seems pretty plausible.
Yeah.
If there is a difference between the cases where composition occurs and the cases where it doesn't, it seems like there should be some series of cases that bridges those two extremes.
Right.
Right. Premise two also seems plausible. I mean, any transition has got to be either a sharp transition or a gradual one.
Right.
Right. Premise three, that there can't be these brute facts about composition. I think this is motivated by the thought that the occurrence of composition should be grounded in some non-arbitrary features of the objects involved.
Right. And their relations.
Yeah. All right.
Not just some inexplicable switch that gets flipped at a certain point in the series.
Yeah. And the minute differences along a Sorites series for composition, it doesn't seem like they could ground such a fundamental difference in compositional status.
Yeah.
Now, premise four, the claim that there can't be borderline cases of composition.
Right.
This one's probably the most debated. It might seem natural to think that, just as we have vague terms like bald,
right,
where there are borderline cases, people with just a few remaining hairs. We could also have borderline cases of composition.
Right.
So, like when a hammerhead is only loosely connected to the handle.
Yeah.
But one way to defend premise four is to appeal to a connection between composition and the cardinality of objects.
Right. So the argument goes something like this. Premise six. If there can be genuine borderline cases of composition, then it can be indeterminate how many objects exist in a given situation.
Right.
Premise seven. However, it cannot be genuinely indeterminate how many concrete objects exist.
Right.
And then, therefore, you get back to premise four. There cannot be borderline cases of composition.
Right. Okay. So the reasoning behind premise six is that if it's vague whether the handle and the head compose a hammer,
right,
then it seems like it would follow that it's also vague whether there are two objects, the handle and the head, or three, the handle, the head, and the hammer.
Right, yeah.
Right.
And then premise seven, this is often defended by appealing to the apparent precision of counting and quantification in our basic understanding of the world.
Yeah.
So if we accept this line of reasoning, it seems like we're forced to choose between universalism and nihilism.
Right.
These two radical alternatives.
Right.
Yeah. But there are ways to resist that conclusion, right? I mean, you could try to argue that even in those borderline cases of apparent composition,
right,
there's still some further entity there, like maybe a proto-hammer or something.
Yeah.
Right. And that would allow you to preserve a determinate number of objects.
Yeah.
You could also try to challenge premise seven,
right,
and say that maybe there is some vagueness that infects our fundamental quantifiers.
Yeah.
So that it could be indeterminate.
Yeah.
What it means to say there is something in those borderline cases.
Right.
Okay. So we've got Sorites arguments. Another set of really, really classic philosophical puzzles. Have to do with the issue of material constitution.
Right.
And so here, I mean, the core puzzle is brought out by thinking about a clay statue.
Right.
So let's say we've got a clay statue that we name Athena.
And it's formed from a particular piece of clay that we call peace.
Okay.
Right. And so our initial thought here is that, well, Athena and peace, they're just one and the same thing, right? They're just being described under different concepts.
Yeah.
But this seemingly simple identification encounters some pretty serious difficulties when we start thinking about statements like the following.
Right.
Right. So statement 1, Athena exists and peace exists.
Okay.
Right. Statement 2, if Athena exists and peace exists, and they occupy the same space at the same time and are composed of the same matter, then Athena is identical to peace.
Okay.
Right. Statement 3, Athena has properties that peace lacks, and peace has properties that Athena lacks.
Yeah.
Right. So, for example, peace could survive being squashed flat into a shapeless lump,
Right.
whereas Athena, as a statue with a specific form, couldn't survive that.
Right. Right.
Right. And then statement 4, if Athena has different properties from peace, then by Leibniz's law, Athena is not identical to peace.
Right.
Right. So these 4 seemingly plausible statements, they lead to a contradiction.
Yeah, they do. And those conflicting intuitions, they've led some philosophers to Illuminati.
Yeah.